So today I will speak about the cytosolic calcium with a special focus on local and average concentrations. But I also added at the very last moment the role of mitochondria at the end, because very recent experimental data has been published by other group, which I think give particular interest of our result if we view them in the point of view of the mitochondria. So just to give you an overview of the calcium fluxes, we know that the main, at least for me as an engineer, the main goal of the calcium inside the skeletal muscle is to activate the actomyosin cycle. So when the stimulation arrives, the sarcoplasmic reticulum release a huge amount of calcium, which bound the troponin C, displays the tropomyosin, allow for the actomyosin contraction, and when the stimulation stops, the circuit takes this back to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. But we know that this is just a part of the story. The calcium has a lot of other role in the cells, and in fact also its flux is much more complex than this. Beside the troponin and the circa and the release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it is also bound from parvalbumin, which will have a special role in this presentation, from the ATP and also from the mitochondria. But here I have put a question mark on the flux to the mitochondria, because there is a open debate of how much calcium actually is taken from the mitochondria. Now, I'm not the right person, and this is not the right place where to make a comprehensive discussion about it. But I would say that currently the majority of the idea is about the fact that the mitochondria cannot handle too much calcium. We know that the mitochondria, of course, can accumulate calcium since the 60s, but soon after that, this is one example, Semberovich in the 85, a relatively low flux of maximum intake of the calcium to the mitochondria has been shown, like about 2% of the maximal rate of calcium uptake of the, for instance, of the sarcoplasmic reticulum calcium pumps. So this leads to the idea that it's not big, the amount of calcium taken from the mitochondria. However, even though not clearly against it, there are some more recent experimental data which cannot easily fit to this point of view. First of all, we know that the mitochondrial calcium can follow is synchronous with the cytosolic transient, so can follow the changes in the cytosolic transient very easily. Then there are some evidences that where the mitochondria is not uptaking calcium, there is some variation in the cytosolic calcium concentration, even though this is not observed constantly. So there is still some debate on it. And on the other side, there is also different technique which allow for an inferring of the maximal uptake of the calcium from the MCU, which actually gives value much higher than observed before, even up to some millimole per liter of fiber per second. And finally, there is this, in our opinion, new, very interesting observation made by Lambolet in Science Advance in 2021, which show an aspect which is usually not very well known in the mitochondria, so the ability of buffering the calcium. So they observed that in quiescent cells, actually in wild type, the ratio between calcium bound and calcium free is can range at least from 1,000 to 5,000 or even more, 10,000. So if we match this evidence with the evidence that the free calcium inside the mitochondria is well known to increase about of 1 or 2 micromolar, clearly making some calculation, it should lead at least to an extrapolation of the net rate of calcium uptake from mitochondria, which is still in the range of the millimole per liter of fiber per second, here about 0.5. So in this respect, we are interested in this result because we decided to analyze the parvalbumin knockout mice using them as a model in order to highlight highlight the calcium fluxes. The reason is that the parvalbumin is known to be the most abundant cytosolic calcium buffer and is able to hide to the probes huge amounts, several hundreds of micromolar of calcium during tetanic stimulation. But despite this, the fibers with parvalbumin, with ablation of the parvalbumin, are still able to sustain an almost physiological force during high-frequency stimuli. And moreover, very recent, even this very recent data published by people in our department shown some evidence or some suggestion that the total amount of calcium is actually preserved in the parvalbumin knockout fibers, thanks to the expression analysis of the expression of the genes most relevant for the sarcoplasmic calcium handling and their protein levels, which are not different from wild type and parvalbumin knockout. So we are interested in where is the calcium, which in the parvalbumin knockout fibers is not bound, of course, by parvalbumin, and we call it parvalbumin extra calcium. Of course, the first idea can be that the calcium is actually kept inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum, because even though it is able to handle the calcium almost physiologically, the absence of the parvalbumin may lead to a lower depletion of the calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So we observed the amount of calcium inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and we did not observe any significant difference between the calcium, both in the quiescent cells and as a relative depletion of the calcium in wild type versus parvalbumin knockout. So this suggests that the sarcoplasmic reticulum actually release the same probably amount of calcium as in the wild type cells. So the other hypothesis, of course, is if it is released the same amount of calcium, it will probably stay on the cytosolic space. So we analyzed, of course, the signal inside this compartment, inside the cell, first skeletal muscle, and we did not observe any significant difference in the steady state after during 2 seconds of stimulation between parvalbumin and knockout and wild type fibers. I say that during the steady state because actually there is a significant difference in the behavior during the first 100 of milliseconds, where the parvalbumin knockout fibers actually tends to show this high peak, we see it in red, high peak at the beginning, which is in a few hundred of milliseconds erased, and again the signal is reached the same level as in the wild type. So, of course, from here, we started to think where the extra calcium should be, from which compartment should be taken. And we focused in particular on 2 different compartments, the mitochondria, as I said at the beginning, and the extracellular space. So our collaborators in Chieti, they were also speakers in this conference, analyzed which are the structural modification that the ablation of the parvalbumin lead to the mitochondria, and they actually observed a significant difference both in the volume. In the parvalbumin knockout, mitochondria are higher, bigger, and also in the distance from the RYR, because in the parvalbumin knockout the mitochondria are closer to the release of the calcium, and both this evidence actually favors the absorption of the calcium from the mitochondria. In fact, we analyzed also the signal of the free calcium inside the mitochondria, showing that there is a significant difference in the parvalbumin knockout fibers, because while in the wild type fibers, following our calibration, the free calcium appeared to be about 500-700 nanomolar. In the parvalbumin knockout fibers, it appears to be 1.5 micromolar, which of course become important if we consider it in the point of view of this high buffering capacity, which has been recently shown by others. Nevertheless, we also analyzed the exchange of calcium with the extracellular space, again, our collaborators found a significant difference between the wild type and the parvalbumin knockout of the number in the sarcoplasmic reticulum stacks, which is, as is well known in the literature, an indication of how much calcium the cytosolic space exchange with the extracellular space. However, of course, it's not easy to make it quantitatively, this comparison. We tried this because using in literature the analysis of the peak calcium uptake from the T system in wild type and two different mouse model, because again, our collaborators have the information about how many sarcoplasmic reticulum stacks are observed in the wild type and those two different mouse model, so that we were able to construct a sort of relationship between the maximum flux versus the extracellular space and the number of stacks, and put our result for the parvalbumin knockout model, observing that a factor of about 1.5 or 2 maximum is the increase of the flux toward the extracellular space respect the wild type. Okay, so from here I started from what is more my background, is the mathematical modeling, because we used a mathematical model in order to quantitatively determine whether the observed modification associated to the parvalbumin ablation could be actually compatible with the uptake of part of total of this parvalbumin extra calcium. I don't want to enter too much in details. I do not show any equation. Of course, if you are interested in the equation, please ask me and contact me, because it will be a pleasure for me to discuss about it. But I have to explain two main things. One is that in the model, of course, we kept all the major actors that I described before. So we analyzed the cytosolic space, sarcoplasmic reticulum space, the extracellular space, and the mitochondria, and also included several buffering, as well as the parvalbumin and the troponin, of course. In the parvalbumin, we also added the effect of the magnesium, which is a competitor of the calcium in the binding of the parvalbumin. And the second aspect, more important, is that we used a diffusion reaction model, in the sense that we analyzed the diffusion of the calcium from the air wire to the central part of the cytosolic space, in order to keep into consideration how much this displacement of the mitochondria can actually affect the absorption of calcium in the parvalbumin knockout fibers. Just a short point, if we do not include any element which can strongly absorb calcium inside the model, of course, it predicted that actually the sarcoplasmic reticulum tend to deplete as in the wild type, but the calcium stays in the cytosolic space, increasing the free calcium of 1 order of magnitude, which is, of course, not observed experimentally. On the other side, we observed that in the wild type fibers, the parvalbumin in the model is seen to buffer several hundreds, up to 600 micromolar of calcium. So this is the quantity that must be uptaken from some other mechanism. Then we focus first on the mitochondria. We first included qualitatively the behavior of the buffering inside the mitochondria, following the result from Basil et al. In 2013 on cardiac muscle, because they observed two levels of buffering. One is a linear buffering, and the other is a very high cooperative buffer. But this is only qualitatively. For the quantitative part, we focused on the data from Lambolet, which is focused on the skeletal muscle, keeping the ratio of bound versus free calcium at the same level as observed. In fact, in the model, the total calcium for the wild type bound to the buffer is about between 3,000 and 4,000 times the amount of the free calcium. And then we modulate the ratio, the maximum rate of uptake of the MCU, in order to see if there is a value, and which is this value, which can actually reproduce the experimental data. In fact, this value exists. We were able to reproduce with the model the data in the cytosolic space, sarcoplasmic reticulum, as well as the mitochondrial space, as shown in the figure. But we had to include a value of maximal intake of about 5 millimolar per second, millimolars, per second per liter of fiber, which is clearly a high value, but after all, not so far from what we have seen in my previous slide. Okay, I think we can, because of time, trying to keep it short, I switch to the extracellular space, just saying that we try to do the same with the same technique and analysis through the mathematical model, but we observe that in order to keep the amount of calcium in the cytosolic space low as in the wild type, we had to increase the exchange of calcium with the extracellular space by a factor of 70, which is much higher than the factor of 2 that we have inferred experimentally. And moreover, the model is not able in this case to keep the initial peak of the calcium at low level as observed experimentally. So we can say that from the model, the extracellular fluxes are less likely effective in the extrusion of the pervalbumin extra calcium. Okay, so those are my conclusion. We observed and we can confirm at least that the pervalbumin ablation induces modification in the mouse fast skeletal muscle in order to preserve the physiological calcium handling in the cytosolic space and therefore also of the fourth generation. We observed that there were significant structural modification on the mitochondria, bigger and closer to the high calcium cytosolic regions in the pervalbumin knockout fibers, which may be compatible with the removal of more than 500 micromolar of calcium, which are not handled in the pervalbumin knockout fibers. But of course, the high buffering capacity is needed in order to interpret this result. At the same level, the extracellular space is probably involved in it, but with much less effectiveness. So in some sense, our take-home message is that our result open a new point of view on the mitochondria as a potential buffer of cytosolic calcium in skeletal muscle, at least we would say in non-physiological situation. Okay, just a few seconds to acknowledge the work of the people who contribute to this result in our Department of Biomedical Science at the University of Padua, Carlo Reggiani and Anna Raffaello, as well as Marta Canato and Leonardo Nogara for the experimental data, and the Department of Neuroscience at the University of Chieti, Feliciano Protasi and Simona Boncompagni. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I am open for questions.
Thank you, Lorenzo, especially from so far off. All right. Anybody have any questions for Lorenzo? Yeah. Dr. Carrero has a comment. Here you go.
Lorenzo, could you say that your pervalbumin negative model is similar to the slow muscle fibers, which are rich in mitochondria and have no pervalbumin? Did you do this physiological comparison that you have a model in the same animal? Is this a criticism of hypercritic Sugo, or there is something?
No. I think you are right. If you are suggesting to use the model also for trying to see how much it works for the slow muscle, I agree. I mean, clearly the pervalbumin knockout fibers can be seen as a good midpoint between fast and slow, so will be very interesting. I just, as a theoretician, I can say that it's very difficult to find proper values for the parameters. It's not usually easy, and so some work must be done. But I agree that it could be done, it should be done.
What is midnight or 1 o'clock. It is midnight in Japan, or one.
Luckily, it is midnight since last week you had the change
Thank
of
you very
time.
much.
So
And then we have a coffee.